The city of Geneva had never seen anything like this before, and Park Ji-won was certain he would never see anything like it again in his entire life. Not if he lived to be 100 years old and traveled to every corner of the world that humans had ever touched with their feet or their flags or their dreams of something greater than themselves. He stood near the back of the Grand Hall, clipboard in hand, watching as delegates from every major nation filed through security checkpoints that seemed both ridiculously advanced and somehow completely inadequate for what was about to happen here, today and every day for the next week. Until history was made or destroyed, depending on who you asked, the summit was called the Geneva Accord, a simple name for something that would change everything humanity thought they knew about the world and about themselves, and about the creatures they had called monsters in their stories for thousands of years before this moment arrived like a storm that everyone saw coming, but nobody could stop. Vampires were real, and they had been real for longer than human civilization had existed. And now they wanted peace after centuries of hidden conflict that most humans never even knew was happening in the shadows of their ordinary lives. Ji-won was 28 years old, and he spoke 7 languages fluently, and he had earned his position at this summit through nothing more than hard work and a talent for making words sound right when they crossed from one tongue to another, like travelers crossing borders that existed only in the minds of people who needed to believe that differences mattered more than similarities. He was backup staff, the kind of person who only got called when someone more important got sick or made a mistake or simply needed sleep after working too many hours on documents that would shape the future of 2 species that had spent millennia circling each other, like wolves who could not decide whether to fight or to share the territory that neither of them could truly claim as their own. The boys. Main hall filled with humans in expensive suits and vampires in clothing that cost more than Ji-won would earn in a decade. And he watched them all with the quiet attention of someone who had learned long ago that invisible people see everything while visible people see only what they want to see. And then she arrived, and the entire room went silent in a way that Ji-won had never experienced before. A silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat and wondered if everyone else could hear it too. Lady Seraphine, the vampire queen, walked through the main entrance with 200 guards surrounding her in perfect formation. Their movements synchronized like a single organism with hundreds of limbs and one terrible purpose, which was to protect the most powerful being on the planet from anything and anyone who might wish her harm. She was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, like staring at the sun or at a truth you had been avoiding for your entire life. And Ji-won understood immediately why humans had written so many stories about creatures like her. Creatures who could make you forget your own name just by walking into a room. But Ji-won did not freeze when she entered, and he did not gasp like the diplomats around him, and he did not feel his blood turn cold with the fear that seemed to grip everyone else in the hall like a hand made of ice and shadow. He was reading a translation document, checking his work one final time before submitting it to his supervisor, and he simply did not notice her entrance until she had already passed his position near the back wall and moved toward the central platform where the negotiations would take place. He looked up, saw her seated among her advisors, and then returned to his work because deadlines did not care about vampire queens or historic summits or the fear that made other people forget how to breathe. The first day passed slowly, filled with speeches and introductions and careful words that meant nothing and everything at the same time. And Ji-won worked through all of it without complaint or rest or any thought beyond the next document that needed his attention. When the evening break arrived, he found an empty observation lounge on the 3rd floor, a quiet room with tall windows that looked out over the city lights. And he sat alone with a simple meal and a book he had been trying to finish for 3 weeks. The room was peaceful in a way that the rest of the building was not, and Ji-won allowed himself to relax for the first time since arriving in Geneva too. Days before this moment that would change everything, he thought he knew about power and fear and what it meant to be truly seen by someone who had no reason to look. He heard the door open, but did not look up immediately because people came and went in buildings like this all the time. And he assumed it was another staff member seeking the same quiet escape he had found. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. And Ji-won finally raised his eyes from his book and saw her standing just inside the doorway, alone, without a single guard in sight for the first time in 800 years. According to every record and rumor and whispered story that had ever been told about the vampire queen, Lady Seraphine crossed the empty room with slow and deliberate steps, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that should have made him run or scream or at least stand up and bow like anyone with sense would do when facing the ruler of an empire that had existed before human beings invented writing or wheels or fire. But Ji-won did not run, and he did not scream, and he did not bow, because his body seemed to have forgotten how to move while his mind tried to understand why she was here, and why she was alone, and why she was walking toward him as if he mattered when he was nothing more than a backup translator with no power and no connections and no reason to exist in her world at all. She stopped beside his table and looked down at him with ancient eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations he had only read about in history books. And then she did something that made even less sense than anything that had happened before. She sat down beside him, not across from him, but right next to him, close enough that he could feel the cold that radiated from her skin like winter from a window that had been left open too long. Her guards remained outside, and Ji-won could hear them shifting nervously beyond the closed door, but none of them entered because she had not commanded them to enter. And her word was law in ways that human leaders could only dream about. The silence stretched between them like a bridge made of glass, fragile and transparent and ready to shatter at the first wrong word or movement. And then she spoke, and her voice was soft and curious and nothing like the cold command he had expected from someone who had ruled an empire of darkness for longer than most human nations had existed. You are the only person in this building who did not flinch when I entered the main hall this morning, she said, and her words hung in the air like questions waiting for answers that Ji-won was not sure he could give. Tell me why. Ji-won stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing through 1,000 possible answers and finding none of them good enough for a queen who had probably heard every lie and flattery and desperate excuse that human beings had ever invented to save themselves from creatures more powerful than they could ever hope to become. He could lie and tell her that he was too brave to fear her, but she would know it was a lie because she had lived for 800 years and had learned to read human faces the way ordinary people read books or newspapers or the simple expressions of their friends. He could stay silent and hope she would lose interest and leave. But something in her eyes told him that silence would be worse than any wrong answer he could give, so he told the truth, because the truth was all he had left when everything else had been taken away by the simple fact of her presence beside him in this quiet room. I was reading a translation document, he said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Too calm for the situation and too honest for his own good. I did not notice you enter because I was checking my work for errors before the deadline, and by the time I looked up, you had already passed my position near the back wall. She stared at him with those ancient eyes, and he waited for anger or amusement or the cold dismissal that powerful people gave to those who wasted their time with ordinary answers to extraordinary questions. But instead she laughed, and the sound was so unexpected that Ji-won nearly jumped out of his chariot. It was not a cruel laugh or a mocking laugh, or even the polite laugh that people used when they wanted to seem friendly without actually feeling anything at all. but a real laugh that came from somewhere deep inside her chest and escaped before she could stop it outside the door. Her guards went completely still, and Jaewon could feel their confusion and alarm, even through the thick walls that separated them from this moment that should not have been happening. "You did not notice me," she repeated, and there was wonder in her voice like a child discovering something new and precious for the first time. "In 800 years, no one has ever failed to notice me when I entered a room. Not once, not ever. And you missed my arrival because you were checking your translation work for errors." Jiwon did not know what to say, so he said nothing and waited for her to continue because this was her moment, to fill with whatever words she chose to give. And she leaned back in her chair and looked out the window at the city, lights that glittered like stars that had fallen to Earth and refused to die. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer than before, almost fragile in a way that did not match her reputation at all. "Do you know what it is like to be feared by everyone you meet?" she asked, and the question seemed genuine rather than rhetorical. "Do you understand what happens to a person when every interaction is calculated and every word spoken to them is designed to please or to manipulate or to avoid the punishment that everyone assumes will come if they say the wrong thing?" Jiwon thought about her question carefully before answering because he sensed that careful thought was exactly what she wanted from him in this strange and unexpected conversation. "I do not know what that is like," he admitted. "I am a backup translator with no power and no wealth and no connections to anyone important. And people do not fear me or calculate their words around me because I have nothing to give them and nothing to take from them." She turned to look at him again, and something in her expression had changed, softened like ice beginning to melt under unexpected warmth. "You have something very rare," she said. "You have nothing to gain from this conversation and nothing to lose by being honest with me. And that makes you more valuable than every diplomat and advisor in this building combined." She asked him more questions then, questions that no one had dared to answer truthfully in centuries, of her rule over an empire that spanned continents and generations, and the endless darkness that humans feared more than death itself. What did humans really think of vampires when they whispered to each other in private moments away from the ears that could hear them? Did ordinary people fear her personally, or just the power she represented? What would humans do if vampires disappeared tomorrow and the world returned to the way it had been before the truth was revealed? And Jiwon answered each question with the same simple honesty that had started this conversation, because he had no reason to lie and no desire to pretend that he knew more or felt less than he actually did. "Most humans think vampires are monsters from old stories," he said. "They grew up with movies and books that showed creatures like you as evil and hungry, and incapable of anything except violence and hunger. And they do not know how to replace those images with something more complicated or more true. And you?" she asked. "What do you see when you look at me?" Jiwon considered her question with the same care he gave to difficult translations, searching for the right words in the language of truth rather than the language of fear or flattery. "I see someone who is tired," he said finally. "I see someone who has carried power for so long that she has forgotten what it feels like to set it down, even for a moment. Even in a room like this, where no one is watching except the translator who will go home to his small apartment in Seoul next week and never see you again." The silence that followed his words was different from the silence that had come before. Heavier somehow, but also warmer, like a blanket that had been placed over a wound that had been bleeding for too long. Lady Seraphine reached up to her hand and removed a silver ring that glittered with gems that had probably been mine before Jiwon's grandparents were born. And she placed it on the table between them, like an offering or a promise or a question she did not know how to ask with words. "For this moment," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, "I am not a queen, and you are not a translator. And we are just two people sitting beside a window watching a city that belongs to neither of us. Before Ji-won could respond, the door burst open and a guard rushed in with his weapon drawn. His eyes scanning the room for threats that did not exist. Lady Seraphine raised her hand without looking away from the window, and the guard froze in place like a statue made of flesh and fear and absolute obedience. "Leave," she commanded, and her voice carried the weight of 8 centuries of power that could not be challenged or questioned or denied. "I am having a conversation with my friend." The guard retreated immediately, and the door closed behind him. And Jaewon sat in stunned silence as he tried to understand what had just happened and what it meant that the vampire queen had called him her friend in front of a witness who would surely tell everyone what he had heard. She turned to face him again, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that looked almost like hope. "Tell me about your small apartment in Seoul," she said. And the request was so ordinary and so unexpected that Ji-won could not help but smile as he began to describe a life that could not have been more different from hers if he had invented it from nothing at all. The news spread through the summit like fire through dry grass, burning through every delegation and every hallway and every whispered conversation that took place in the shadows of the grand building where history was being made one careful word at a time. The vampire queen had met privately with a human, a nobody, a backup translator with no family connections and no political power and no explanation for why she would choose to spend even 1 minute of her precious time in his unremarkable presence. Intelligence agencies from 12 different countries launched investigations into Park Ji-won before the sun rose the next morning, digging through every record and every file and every scrap of information that might explain how an orphan from Seoul had captured the attention of the most powerful vampire in existence. They found nothing unusual because there was nothing unusual to find, just a story of loss and hard work and quiet determination. That would have been inspiring in a movie, but seemed almost disappointing to people who wanted conspiracies and secrets and hidden agendas that would make sense of what had happened. Ji-won was raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12 years old, and he had worked 3 jobs while studying at university to earn a degree that gave him access to the world of international diplomacy. And he had learned 7 languages not through expensive schools or private tutors, but through library books and free online courses and an endless patience for the slow work of understanding how different people said the same things in different ways. He was exactly what he appeared to be, which made the whole situation even more confusing for the powerful people who had built their lives on the assumption that nothing was ever exactly what it appeared to be. Lady Seraphine made everything more complicated. On the second day of the summit, when she requested Ji-won as her personal translator for the remaining negotiations, bypassing senior diplomats who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity, the human delegations protested in private meetings that grew louder and more desperate as the hours passed without any change in the Queen's decision. The vampire nobles sent carefully worded messages expressing their concern about security and protocol and the proper way things should be done when the fate of 2 species hung in the balance, but no one dared to challenge her directly because her word was law and her power was absolute, as she had ruled her empire for 8 centuries without ever needing permission or approval from anyone who lived beneath her shadow. So Ji-won found himself standing beside the vampire queen at every negotiation session, translating her words into human languages and translating human responses back into the ancient tongue she preferred when speaking to her own kind. He watched her work And what he saw was nothing like the monster from the stories he had grown up hearing. She was brilliant in ways that made the human politicians look like children playing at games they did not understand, seeing angles and implications and long-term consequences that would not become clear for decades or centuries after everyone currently alive had turned to dust. But she was also tired in ways that no one else seemed to notice, carrying weights that had nothing to do with the crown she wore or the power she wielded. Weights made of loneliness and suspicion and the slow erosion of trust that happened when everyone you met wanted something from you and no one wanted. Yuji-wan saw the assassination attempt she deflected without expression, subtle poisonings and magical attacks and political maneuvers designed to weaken her position just enough for rivals to strike when the moment was right. He saw the betrayals from members of her own court, advisors and nobles who smiled to her face while plotting her destruction in messages they thought she would never see or hear or understand. She absorbed each betrayal in silence. And Ji-won understood that she had been absorbing betrayals like this for so long that she had forgotten there was any other way to live on the third day of negotiations. A human delegate from a country that had lost many people to vampire attacks. Before the truce made a speech that seemed polite on the surface, but contained insults hidden in the careful arrangement of his words. References to vampire cruelty and the blood they had spilled and the families they had destroyed in ages, when humans were nothing but prey to be hunted and consumed. The room fell silent as the delegate finished speaking, and every eye turned to Lady Seraphine to see how she would respond to words that had been designed to wound her in ways that could not be officially addressed without creating an incident that would derail the entire summit. Jun felt the tension building like pressure before a storm, and he made a decision that would change everything, without stopping to think about whether it was wise or foolish or simply the only thing he could do in that moment when he translated the delegate's words into the vampire tongue. He softened the insults into misunderstandings about cultural differences, turning accusations into awkward compliments that had been poorly phrased by someone unfamiliar with the proper way to address royalty. Lady Seraphine's response was measured and diplomatic, accepting the compliments with grace and moving the conversation forward as if nothing unusual had happened. The human delegate looked confused, and the other translators exchanged glances that suggested they knew exactly what Ji-won had done. But no one said anything because saying something would mean admitting that insults had been intended, and that would create the very incident everyone was trying to avoid after the session ended. Lady Seraphine summoned Ji-won to a private meeting room where no guards or advisors were allowed to enter. She stood by the window with her back to him, and when she spoke, her voice was curious rather than angry. "You changed his words," she said. And it was not a question, but a statement of fact that she expected him to confirm or deny. "Yes," Ji-won admitted, because he had already learned that lying to her was pointless, and truth was the only currency she valued from him. "Why?" she asked, turning to face him with those ancient eyes that had seen empires rise and fall and rise again. "You owe me nothing, and protecting my dignity could have cost you your position. If anyone important had noticed what you did," Ji-won thought about her question, the same way he thought about difficult translations, searching for the words that would carry meaning without distortion or loss. "Because cruelty is easy," he said finally, "and you looked like you have had enough of it." The silence that followed was different from any silence they had shared before, heavier with meaning and lighter with something that might have been hope if either of them had been brave enough to name it. She crossed the room and stood before him, close enough that he could see the faint lines around her eyes that suggested exhaustion rather than age, close enough that he could feel the cold that radiated from her skin like winter from a distant mountain. "In 800 years, she said softly, "no one has ever protected me without expecting something in return. Not once, not ever. and I do not know what to do with a kindness that comes without conditions or demands or hidden agendas, waiting to reveal themselves when I am most vulnerable. Ji-won met her eyes without flinching, without fear, without anything except the simple honesty that had brought them to this moment. "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. "You can just accept it and let it be what it is. A small gift from someone who saw that you were tired and wanted to give you one moment of peace in a world that has given you very little." She reached out and touched his hand, and her skin was cold, but her touch was gentle, almost uncertain, like someone who had forgotten how to receive comfort and was learning again for the first time in centuries. "Stay beside me," she said, and the words were a request rather than a command. "Not because I order you to stay, but because I am asking. And asking is something I have not done in so long that I am not sure I remember how to do it properly." Jae-won nodded, and something passed between them in that moment. Something that had nothing to do with power or politics or the centuries that separated their worlds. Something that felt almost like friendship, beginning to take root in soil that had been barren for far too long. The final night of the summit arrived, with a grand ceremonial dinner that brought together every delegate and dignitary and important person who had played any role in creating the treaty that would end centuries of shadow conflict. Between humans and vampires, the ballroom was decorated with flowers and lights and symbols from both human and vampire cultures. A careful blend designed by committees who had argued for weeks about every detail to ensure that neither side felt diminished or forgotten in the celebration of what they were about to accomplish together. Ji-won stood behind Lady Seraphine's chair, dressed in formal clothing that the summit organizers had provided. When they realized that a backup translator's wardrobe was not adequate for events where the future of two species would be written in signatures and seals, and the hope that promises made tonight would be kept for generations to come, he watched the room with the same quiet attention he had always brought to his work, noticing the way people moved and spoke and positioned themselves around the tables that filled the enormous space. The treaty documents sat on a central platform, waiting for the signatures that would make them official. And Lady Seraphine sat at the head table with human leaders on one side and vampire nobles on the other. A living bridge between worlds that had been at war for so long that peace seemed almost impossible, even now that it was finally within reach. Everything was perfect, which was why Ji-won noticed when something was wrong. 3 servers moved through the crowd with trays of wine and food, their steps synchronized in a way that seemed almost military to his eyes, their faces calm in a way that did not match the nervous energy of the other staff members who understood the importance of the night and feared making mistakes that would be remembered forever. He had spent years translating documents from every corner of the world, including medical and scientific papers that described techniques used by assassins and spies to hide their true nature from observation. He knew about drugs that could slow a person's heartbeat to make them seem calm even when their blood was filled with adrenaline and their minds were focused on violence, and he knew that vampires could hear heartbeats, which meant that anyone planning to attack a vampire would need exactly those kinds of drugs to avoid detection. 3 servers were moving toward Lady Seraphine's table in a pattern that would bring them all within striking distance at the same moment. A coordinated approach that made no sense for people who were simply delivering food and drinks to hungry guests. Ji-won's heart raced as he calculated his options and found none of them good enough to guarantee her safety. He could not warn her verbally, because the servers were close enough to hear him and would simply attack immediately, rather than waiting for their planned moment. He could not reach the guards quickly enough because they were positioned around the edges of the room and the servers were already too close to the queen. He could not fight them. Himself because he was a translator with no combat training and no weapons and no chance of surviving a confrontation with people who were clearly professional killers. So he did the only thing he could think of, the only action that might disrupt their timing enough to save her life. He stepped forward and deliberately crashed into a passing server, knocking an entire tray of red wine directly onto Lady Seraphine's gown. Crimson liquid splashed across white fabric that was probably worth more than everything G1 had ever owned combined, spreading like blood from a wound as the queen rose from her chair in shock and confusion. The room erupted in chaos as staff members rushed forward with napkins and apologies, and guards moved toward the commotion to protect their queen from whatever was happening. And the careful choreography of the assassination fell apart in the face of an accident that no one could have predicted. The three servers hesitated for just a moment, their plans disrupted by the sudden movement and the guards who were now positioned between them and their target. And that moment of hesitation was enough. Lady Seraphine's personal guards noticed the hesitation, noticed the way the servers' hands moved toward hidden weapons rather than toward napkins or apologies. And they acted with the speed and violence that had kept their queen alive for 8 centuries of plots and betrayals and attempts on her life. The three would-be assassins were subdued in seconds, their weapons confiscated and their arms twisted behind their backs as guards shouted orders and delegates scrambled away from the violence that had suddenly erupted in the middle of what was supposed to be a celebration of peace. G1 did not resist when security personnel grabbed him and dragged him away from the queen, assuming that his attack on her gown was part of the assassination attempt rather than the accident that had disrupted it. Did not try to explain what he had done or why, because explanations would have to wait until the chaos settled and someone took the time to listen to a backup translator whose actions made no sense to anyone who had not seen what he had seen. They put him in a holding room, a small space with bare walls and a single chair and a door that locked from the outside, and he sat in silence waiting for whatever would happen next. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes that felt like hours, because time moved differently when you were alone in a room wondering if you had saved a life or thrown away your own for nothing. The door opened, and G1 looked up expecting to see guards or investigators or someone official who would demand answers to questions. He was not sure how to answer. Instead, he saw Lady Seraphine standing in the doorway, alone again, without a single guard in sight, despite the fact that someone had just tried to kill her less than an hour ago. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, and the click of the lock engaging was the loudest sound G1 had ever heard. She was still wearing the stained gown. The red wine spread across the white fabric like a map of the disaster he had created to save her life. And she stood before him with an expression he could not read, despite all his training in understanding the words and meanings that hid behind human faces. "You ruined a dress worth more than your lifetime earnings," she said. And her voice was flat in a way that gave him no clues about what she was feeling or thinking. Giant met her eyes and spoke the only truth that mattered in this moment. "You are alive," he said. She stared at him for a long moment, and then something in her expression shifted, cracked open like ice breaking on a frozen river in the first warm days of spring. "Yes," she said softly, "because a translator who owes me nothing just saved my life." She crossed the room and sat beside him on the narrow bench that served as the holding room's only furniture, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, close enough that he could feel the cold radiating from her skin like winter from a window left open to the night. "They were hired by members of my own court," she said, and her voice carried the weight of a betrayal that was old and familiar and somehow still painful after 800 years of similar wounds. "Nobles who believed that peace with humans would weaken our empire and dilute our power. Nobles I have trusted and protected and elevated to positions they never would have reached without my favor. Ji-won listened in silence, because silence was what she needed right now. Not comfort or advice, or the meaningless words that people offered when they did not know what else to say. "How did you know?" she asked finally, turning to look at him with those ancient eyes that had witnessed so many betrayals that one more should not have mattered. "How did a human translator see what 200 of my guards failed to notice?" Ji-won explained about the translation work he had done over the years. The medical papers and scientific documents that had taught him about drugs that could fool vampire senses. The pattern recognition that came from years of studying words and movements, and the subtle ways that meaning hid beneath the surface of ordinary actions. She listened to his explanation. And when he finished, she reached out and took his hand in hers. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm and real, and somehow warmer than any touch he had ever received from anyone in his life. "You could have done nothing," she said. "You could have let them kill me and walked away with your life intact and your future secure. And no one would have blamed you, because no one expected you to do anything at all." "I could not do nothing," Ji-won replied, "not when I had seen what I saw. Not when doing nothing meant watching you die for the crime of wanting peace." She squeezed his hand once, and then released it and stood, moving toward the door with the grace of someone who had been a queen for so long that every movement was a statement of power, even when she was exhausted and betrayed and wearing a ruined gown in a holding room that smelled of fear and metal at the door. She paused and looked back at him. "The treaty will be signed tomorrow," she said. "And when it is signed, you will stand beside me as my translator, my advisor, and my friend. And everyone in both worlds will know that Park Ji-won from Seoul saved the life of the vampire queen with nothing but his eyes and his courage and a glass of wine that he could never afford to replace." She opened the door and stepped through it, and the guards waiting outside snapped to attention as she passed. One of them looked at Ji-won with confusion and something that might have been respect. And then the door closed and he was alone again. But the loneliness felt different now, lighter somehow. The treaty was signed on a morning filled with sunlight that streamed through the tall windows of the grand hall like a promise of the new world that was being born in the careful strokes of pens, held by hands that had once been raised against each other. In violence and fear, Lady Seraphine signed first, her ancient script flowing across the document with a grace that came from centuries of practice. And then the human leaders added their names beside hers, creating a record that would be studied by historians for as long as either species continued to exist. Ji-won stood behind the queen throughout the ceremony, translating her words to the assembled delegates and translating their responses back to her in the ancient tongue that vampires preferred for matters of state and power, and the solemn promises that bound empires together across the ages. When the last signature was complete, and the seals were pressed into wax that would hold the treaty together through whatever challenges the future might bring, the room erupted in applause that mixed relief with hope and fear with celebration. The Shadow War was over, and a new chapter in the history of both species had begun in the weeks that followed. Ji-won was offered positions that would have seemed like impossible dreams to the backup translator who had arrived in Geneva with nothing but a clipboard and a talent for making words travel between languages without losing their meaning. Intelligence agencies wanted him as an advisor who could help them understand the vampire world he had glimpsed during his time beside the Queen. Corporations offered salaries that would have made his grandmother weep with joy, positions where his skills would be used to negotiate deals worth billions in the new economy that was emerging from the peace. Politicians invited him to dinners and meetings and private conversations where they hoped to learn the secrets of how he had won the trust of the most powerful vampire in existence. He turned down every offer with the same quiet politeness he had shown throughout his life, explaining that he was just a translator who wanted to return home and continue the work he had always done a month after the summit ended. Ji-won was back in his small apartment in Seoul, surrounded by the books and papers and simple furniture that had been his world before Geneva changed everything he thought. He knew about power and fear and the possibility of connection between people who should never have found anything in common. He was reading a translation document when the temperature in his apartment dropped by several degrees, and he looked up to find Lady Seraphine standing in his living room as if appearing out of thin air in the homes of ordinary translators was something she did every day. She was dressed in simple clothing that looked strange on someone who usually wore gowns worth more than his entire building. And she carried no guards or advisors or any of the trappings of power that surrounded her everywhere she went. "Your security is terrible," she said, and there was almost a smile on her lips. "I walked right in without anyone noticing or trying to stop me." Ji-won set down his document and stood to face her, still not entirely sure how to behave around someone who ruled an empire but had also sat beside him in holding rooms and observation lounges and shared truths that she had never shared with anyone else in 800 years of lonely power. "Most people who enter my apartment are not powerful enough to require security measures," he replied. And the words came easily because honesty had become natural between them in ways he had never expected. She looked around at his small space, taking in the crowded bookshelves and the worn furniture and the window that looked out on a view of other apartment buildings, rather than the city lights and mountains that probably surrounded her palaces and estates. "It is smaller than I imagined," she said, but there was no judgment in her voice, only curiosity and something that might have been wonder. And more full of books. She crossed the room and sat on his old couch without asking permission, making herself comfortable in a space that could not have been more different from the halls of power she usually occupied. "I have come to make you an offer," she said, and her voice carried the formal weight of a queen conducting official business. "I want you to serve as my personal advisor, to stand beside me as you did in Geneva, and help me navigate a world that has changed more in the past month than it changed in the previous 8 centuries. Ji-won sat across from her and considered her offer with the same careful thought he gave to difficult translations, weighing words and meanings and the consequences that hid beneath the surface of what was being said. "No," he said finally, and the word hung in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water. Her expression did not change, but something flickered in her ancient eyes, something that might have been disappointment or confusion, or simply the surprise of being refused by someone who had no power to refuse her anything. "May I ask why?" she said, and her voice was softer now, less formal and more curious. Ji-won chose his words carefully because they mattered more than any translation he had ever done. "You do not need someone who serves you," he said. "You have thousands of servants and advisors and nobles who would do anything you command without question or hesitation. And adding one more to that number would not change anything about the loneliness you carry or the walls you have built to protect yourself from a world that has never given you any reason to trust it." He leaned forward slightly, meeting her eyes without fear or calculation or any of the careful masks that people usually wore when speaking to power. "What you need is someone who sees you as a person rather than a queen. Someone who can sit beside you and speak honestly without wanting anything from you except the conversation itself. And that can only happen if I stay outside your world. If I remain the translator from Seoul, who owes you nothing and expects nothing and can therefore offer you the one thing that no one in your court can ever provide." She was silent for a long moment, And Ji-won could see her processing his words the same way he processed difficult translations, searching for the meaning that hid beneath the surface. "And what is that one thing?" she asked finally. "Equality," he said. "The chance to be just a person sitting beside a window, talking to someone who does not flinch when you enter a room because he is too busy checking his translation work to notice that the most powerful being in the world has arrived." She laughed then, the same real laugh that had escaped her in the observation lounge in Geneva, and the sound filled his small apartment with warmth. That had nothing to do with temperature. She stood and reached into her pocket, pulling out the silver ring that she had placed on the table during their first conversation, the ring that symbolized her authority and her power, and the 800 years of rule that had shaped her into the person she had become. "Then take this," she said, pressing the ring into his hand, not as a symbol of service or obligation, but as a reminder that power means nothing without someone willing to sit beside you as an equal, and that the most valuable gift I have ever received was the honesty of a translator who did not notice when I walked into a room. Ji-won looked down at the ring in his palm, feeling the weight of it and understanding that this was not a command or an obligation, but an offering, a piece of herself that she was entrusting to someone who had earned her trust. "By wanting nothing from her except the truth, I will keep it," he said. "And whenever you need to remember what it feels like to be just a person rather than a queen, you will know where to find me." She smiled, and the expression transformed her face in ways that made her seem almost human despite the centuries that separated them. "I will return," she said, "not as a queen seeking an advisor, but as a friend seeking conversation. If that is acceptable." "It is acceptable," Ji-won replied. And for the first time since Geneva, he smiled as she left the way she had come, disappearing into the night without guards or ceremony or any of the fanfare that usually surrounded her movements through the world in the years that followed. Historians and politicians would debate what had changed the vampire queen, what had transformed her rule from cold efficiency to something warmer and more human, despite the fundamental differences between their species. They would point to unexpected moments of fairness and vulnerability, decisions that prioritize people over power, gestures of kindness that seemed to come from nowhere and change the lives of those who received them. Only two people knew the truth, and neither of them ever spoke of it to the historians or the politicians or the curious public who wanted to understand what had happened. The truth was simple, as truths often are when stripped of the complications that people add to make themselves feel important. A queen had sat beside a translator, without guards, and in that moment, she had remembered what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a symbol, to be valued for who she was rather than what she could give, and that remembering had changed everything. Slowly at first, and then more quickly as the years passed and the ring on Ji-won's finger caught the light each time he turned a page, or typed a word, or looked out his window at a world that had become just a little bit kinder because two people from different worlds had found the courage to be honest with each other. Some revolutions are loud, filled with battles and speeches and moments that echo through history like thunder, but others are quiet,